Morning, everyone. It's really nice to see so many of you in the room, considering the last 2 or 3 years we've not been in the rooms with anyone, and I really welcome people online as well. I'm Sarah Govan. I've got a long history of involvement with landscape issues through Historic Scotland, although my career is now with Climate Exchange, so I'm here really as a member of the SLA Executive Committee and an independent researcher within the University of Edinburgh. I don't need to tell you the value of landscape and how much there is still to be done, but I guess what I wanted to concentrate on today was to really take a chance to say it's more than 20 years since the ELC, and just let's try and look at some of the things that we have achieved in the last 20 and more years in terms of how we value and understand Scotland's landscapes. I don't think anyone in the room will necessarily have been there, but I do want to mark that much has been achieved since 1962, when the Landscape Institute and the National Trust of Scotland had their first conference on landscape protection. And I think we can chart quite a lot of what's happened since then back to that conference. It's quite interesting to go back to the conversation that they had. But to begin with, I guess I just want to celebrate the European Landscape Convention, and particularly the definition. It's not just about semantics. I think it's a remarkable achievement that from the initial conception of a convention in the 1990s, that within really a matter of a few years, through negotiation and debate and dialogue across Scotland, and there will be people in this room and online who were very much part of those conversations, we came to an international understanding of what a landscape might mean, how we might come together to agree a definition. And that, for me, is remarkable. The reason for using this slide, I guess it's become an iconic image, I suppose. But this represents in Glen Shiel, one of the national scenic areas in Scotland. It's clearly got a long time depth of geology and geomorphology of human habitation that's visible in the biodiversity and the landscape features. It's the location of the rising of the Jacobites, which the National Trust Monument there marks. Industrial heritage in the construction of the bridge is also fascinating, and those in the room might not know, but it's how I knew I was half an hour away from when we were going on holiday and that I would soon see the sea, so it was one of those markers. What I'm not saying is that for younger generations, and as Stuart was saying, this is now the most visited National Trust site in Scotland because of the Harry Potter connection. And I used this slide in a presentation to some students in Penn State University, and it was really lovely to see the smiles go around the room as they recognised something and they identified with it. Whatever our reasons for bringing each of us to this particular landscape, it demonstrates the wide connection of Scotland's landscapes and their importance. So it's simple to capture what we've achieved, because ultimately some people might perceive them as being boring documents. I've got a long history as a civil servant, and documents are never boring. And what I wanted to capture here was just some of the covers that represent what was a phenomenal amount of work. So let's not forget the landscape character assessment and its relative to the historic land use assessment as we try to understand the whole of Scotland's landscapes, get a sense of understanding and knowing what that evidence base was so that we could then build to make decisions. More recently, there was as part of, I believe there was a strong connection with the ELC and the negotiations, discussions around landscape. So the Natural Futures series of documents focused on individual areas within Scotland. Moving through to the discussion of wild land areas and the historic time depth, and I'm just shuffling because I seem to have lost page 4 of my notes. That's very clever. I'll just bring it. This represents a huge amount of activity, which the debate and discussion that went on, I can remember being in the room for a number of those conferences and discussions. I think the other thing I want to draw attention to is that, like the wildland areas, like the inventories of battlefields and designed landscapes, these represent dimensions of landscape but there's a debate to be had in how we understand landscape and how the different things fit together, how we focus on elements, but how we bring it back to the wider picture. We can't forget the special designations. The national scenic areas were cutting edge at their time. There are debates and discussions around them, but the ELC was a direct driver to review the special qualities and to understand just what value there was in the national scenic areas. But it's really interesting to take them back to that conference in 1962 and the Murray Report and how that followed through. So there's a really fascinating history through that. Not related to the ELC, but tied into it were the timing in terms of the national parks, and I think some of the debate and the discussion around how we manage our landscapes in Scotland was benefited by the establishment of the 2 national parks, and we'll move on to discuss the third one that's being discussed for designation going forward. Local landscape areas, there was, it's perhaps not remembered, but there's a really interesting document pulled together to try and work out how we could help local government as one of the main tools for implementing some of this work. What were the techniques and approaches that could be taken forward. So, as I say, it's back to that idea of the bureaucracy of documents or designations. They are all tools. They're in themselves not perhaps perfect, but each of them serves a role and each of them allows us to look at special places. And looking on the international side, the St Kilda World Heritage Site as the first natural and cultural joint recognition of special qualities, I think is a remarkable step forward. And I also want to flag here in terms of international, the European Landscape Award. I must confess I'm a bit out of touch now, I don't know where that's got to, but at the time when we were first seeing the driver to the European Landscape Convention and with the UK ratifying the convention in 2006, that was another initiative that helped draw attention and draw out the valuing of different landscapes. And one of the things, just in terms of that working together, is the renewal of the position statement between what was Scottish Natural Heritage, now Nature Scot, and Historic Environment Scotland, that updated a memorandum of agreement from 2005, and again draws attention to that landscape is a place, if you like, for drawing people together, for collaboration, for working out where the common ground can be found. But as Rachel said, the ELC is not just about the special, it's about all of Scotland's landscapes and they all deserve attention. And one of the designations I flagged there was the regional parks, of which 3 were designated in the early 1980s. The image here is of the Fife Regional Park, or part of it, in and around Lochore Meadows. If I can't find an image, I'm desperate to find one. But if we'd been in this position in 1982, it would have been completely different. This was a heavily industrialised landscape with pit bins and fires and pit heads and a remarkable amount of effort and resource was put in. I shared an office with the land reclamation team as they came to their end within Fife Regional Council to try and restore what was a hugely degraded landscape. But I think what's important to recognise is that this is now a landscape for the resident community. It serves amenity and community, but also memory. So within the middle we have the Mary Pit Head as a memorial, as a marker to what dominated lives for hundreds of years. The tree line across the middle of the loch is actually the line of the mineral railway, which I think had served for well back into the 19th century. And you can't see it here, but there's a remarkable survival on the right-hand side of an early historic homestead site, which bizarrely has survived through what was hugely destructive activities. So I think this is very much a local landscape. It may not be considered something worthy of designation. It may be. There's a different question on how we decide that, but this is very much the local place and the local landscape for those people in Central Fife and means a lot to them. I don't think we can talk about landscape in the last 20 years without mentioning the resource and support from the Heritage Lottery Fund Landscape Partnership Scheme. there has been an evaluation done of that. I couldn't put my finger on it earlier on this week. I think I've got a printed version somewhere in the pile that is my basement, and I couldn't find it digitally. But there's a phenomenal amount of resource was invested in landscape partnership schemes across the UK and certainly in Scotland. 3 examples here of Dalriada, Coiga Penasant and the Inner Forth. They were a significant benefit to local communities, but I think they also prompted some really interesting conversations about what we mean by landscape. Ultimately, the partnership scheme was about drawing a line on a map where you could demonstrate that there was a community interest, there was a partnership interest, and there were activities that would be beneficial. But a landscape is much more than just a very big place with a ring around it. So I think I personally would like to review some of the achievements through some of those schemes and just look at the difference that resource made, both to the activities within communities, but also how that place looks now, how things have changed. A key tool, I think, that I don't want to lose sight of, that SNH as was pulled together, was talking about our place, which was a toolkit to help local communities understand their place and their landscape. And it's really interesting in this context how those 2 terms are interchangeable. I think it came out at a time when I think all of this is clouded by the financial crash in 2008, which had a knock-on effect to publicly available resources, which was ultimately where some of the plans and the ideas, the ambitions for landscape activity in Scotland were going to be supported through that public sector. We had the 2 national scenic area pilot management projects in Wester Ross and Dumfries and Galloway, and there was some really good work being done locally with that, but it was clear at the time that the next step, the next level, needed that support of resources, and at a time when that simply wasn't available. Political priorities through the 20 teens really moved away from having available resource. So I don't want to lose sight of that really good work that was done and the sense that we could have built on it at the time. There were issues that drew away from that, but that doesn't prevent those opportunities from being grasped as we go forward into the 2020s. So I struggled to find, and I would like to speak to NatureSpot to see if they have a resource of who actually was able to use talking about our place and how we saw that impact. But just to flag, there's the images here are Recite, which actually was supported through the Climate Challenge Fund, the 100th anniversary of the first garden village in Scotland. The community took over a piece of abandoned land and have created an orchard, and the larger picture is showing that orchard this year. It's a real flourishing community enterprise which is focusing on the local urban landscape. I'm not going to get the name right, but the images on the left are from the Central Scottish Forest Trust and some of the activity there of regeneration and local places and landscapes for everyone. I don't know, I think everyone thinks this way. This is perhaps not the case, but landscapes have always changed and they will continue to change. And I think the examples I have on screen here to the left is Cry from Wood and Borders, where there was a long-standing vision to recreate a natural forest in the Borders, and the image is from 2019, so I didn't bother with it before, but there's a huge change on the ground here. There's an embedded history there. When the archaeological assessments were done before any planting activity was taken forward, there were Mesolithic artefacts retrieved. So people have lived within and through this landscape for millennia, and what we're doing today is taking that forward in a different way. On the right-hand side, Loch Leven shows that time depth, if you like, in a different way. So we have the geology of the Lomond Hills, which are topped with prehistoric monuments. There's actually evidence for effectively a prehistoric landscape here. The crop marks show activity of living, working and dying in this area for millennia. But the loch is designated as a natural nature reserve of international importance to wildfowl. The loch itself is 25% smaller than it was at the end of the 18th century, because it was part of an industrial scheme to promote power generation further down the River Leven, and so it was that the level was reduced. The village that you see just to the bottom left is Kinross, which is, it's impossible to disconnect Loch Leven from Kinross. They are very much part of the same place, and it's part of the local landscape as well as the national landscape. But the Kinross House has one of the inventory designed landscapes within it. And I guess one of the things that strikes me is just the multiplicity of stories you can tell in and around this place. The local community completed a route completely around the loch. You can walk and cycle around it. We all grew up, I mean, I can remember in Dunfermline Primary School going to Loch Leven Castle for one of our school trips. And once I understood the change in loch level, that story of Mary, Queen of Scots, being imprisoned and then fleeing actually takes a different tone when you realise the water level was 2 or 3 metres higher. So the stories that we tell through history of the place are phenomenal, but then also that story is going forward. It is a national nature reserve. The RSPB at Loch Leven is doing a great deal of activity to look at the biodiversity and ecosystems around the area. Could you help? That's it, that's great, thanks. So I guess just keeping on that theme of, on the theme of change, our climate is changing, and that's going to have a significant impact on the landscapes in Scotland, whether that's through the dramatic events of flooding or coastal erosion, of wind throw. Those are the things that we are grappling with now, and a major part of the policy discussion is around how we adapt to that warmer world. One of the things we can learn from is through the archaeology and the history, the environmental history of how things have changed in the past, so getting a bit of a baseline and a calibration on that as we look to move forward. So that brings us up to the moderating policy, which I think there's a lot of active discussion to be had in the impact of climate change on Scotland's landscapes, both in terms of the climate impact, but also in how we respond to that climate impact. So a key tool, a key instrument that will affect Scotland's landscapes is the Climate Change Plan Update, which the quotes that I've put on this slide are from, they're taken from the update. You know, our world-renowned, diverse and rich nature and landscapes. It's right in there on chapter 6 on land use, and recognising the role of nature-based solutions to climate change. Now, the two big ones that are being discussed are tree cover and restoration of degraded peatland. Restoration of degraded peatland, as you can see in the slide on the picture on the left, is a win-win. It protects an ecosystem, it stores carbon. If there are buried archaeological and environmental paleo-environmental remains, it protects and conserves them for the future. I know more about peatland restoration than I thought I would do a few years ago, so you know we can explore that. There are perhaps more landscape impacts on some of the other measures. So the increase of tree cover is a very interesting one. There's a strong argument for increase in tree cover, particularly in landscape and ecosystem scale and in terms of biodiversity. But in all of the policy statements, it's about the right tree in the right place for the right purpose. And I think some of the conversations can mask the underlying science about what will work in what place. And I think that's where the people in this room and online have a huge contribution to make in how we understand what is the right thing to do in what places and what are the choices for different places. There are difficult decisions to make, that how do we frame those in a way that we can get the best compromise or the best outcome. Thank you. So I guess I just wanted to finish off with a couple of slides to cover things I hadn't quite mentioned. I'm very conscious there will be key milestones that I've missed and big things that I've not really touched on. But one of the things I did want to emphasise is that, you know, Scotland is about being a peopled landscape. For me, landscapes are about people, and actually for me, there can be no landscape without people. I think people are within that, and there are conversations as to how that is best managed and how we work, how we take all the other dimensions together. I also need to confess that I personally am not great about taking landscape images with pictures, so I've had to prey on friends and family for this image, particularly with GDPR, you shan't just randomly pull them off. But I think, although the kelpies are an iconic image, they're a really great example of how investment was directed to make a very positive contribution to what had been a deprived and neglected area, and has created something which is of huge local and amenity value, and created a landscape feature which is now internationally renowned. So, to touch on the purpose of today, one of the reasons of coming together today is to celebrate what we have achieved and what we have learned about Scotland's landscapes over the last 20 years and more, but also to think about I haven't yet mentioned the Landscape Charter, which was a key milestone, and not to be underplayed. The fact that a document was pulled together that could be signed by so many people, that was owned and shared as a vehicle, as a tool for managing Scotland landscape, can't be underestimated. I think, again, it perhaps suffered from the various crises of the various policy priorities of the 2010s, with austerity and latterly with Brexit and COVID, which meant with the best will in the world, political attention is taken elsewhere. But now is a good time to reflect on that and say, well, particularly as we move forward in the face of a biodiversity and a climate change emergency, how do we put landscapes in Scotland as a central part to get the most positive outcome? And I guess I want to finish with a slightly provocative question. Each of us sitting in this room and online will have our own special interests on different dimensions of landscape, different aspects that expertise and knowledge is critical to understanding the whole. But the image is drawn from an old Hindustani poem of the Blind Man and the Elephant, where each person is grappling with the bit they understand and actually loses sight of the whole, loses sight of the elephant. And I guess I'm interested to know how we can balance the different interests that we have while focusing on the total landscape, because if there's one thing that I feel strongly about is that the whole landscape is greater than the sum of the parts, and what's great about the Landscape Alliance is how we can come together to find the shared ground while also respecting our special qualities. So I've raced through things there. I have missed an awful lot. My apologies and my respect to those who were involved in the conversations in the 1990s and the 2000s and beyond of actually making a difference on the ground. And I guess I'm hoping that will have stimulated some thoughts and ideas and questions to work out where we've got to now and how we move forward. So, thank you.
That's great. What we really like now is to have a bit of a debate around this, some of the points that Sarah's raised. And so that's everybody online and everyone in the room. So she did put a bit of a provocative statement up there. I'm just wondering if we maybe put that one back up again, if that's possible. And, just to jog people's minds on it. There we go. Which is your area of interest. How can you focus on the total landscape rather than just the specific? So I'm going to open it up to the floor, and perhaps somebody in the room first could maybe just respond to that question that Sarah's put, and we can start to get a bit of a debate going. And those people online, you can, I think, ask a question directly. So do we need to actually take that down to get that going?
No. So if people online just want to put their hand up, then we can come to them.
Yes. Okay.
And then they can ask a question, or if they'd rather put it into the chat, that's fine. But right. They can actually speak to us. We think.
I can read it out if it's in the chat as well.
Okay. So let's go. Somebody in the room. start us off?
If I just maybe suggest that, sorry.
That's all right, Merrick was in there.
You know, while also focusing on the total landscape, well, whose total landscape? So it's the communication with everyone in all parts of society on what it is that's going to help balance the different interests. So it's the engagement topic.
I guess just to respond to that, I completely agree. And although, and I think this is perhaps where it becomes interesting in terms of where boundaries lie, but I think the initiative of the land use strategy and the land use strategy pilots, and there are, they're moving forward at pace. I'm not familiar with how different things are working on the ground, but to me, they're a classic vehicle for communities to come together within those land use pilot areas to talk about the priorities, to find, particularly as the early frameworks start to be developed and the discussions, there are teams working in each of the areas on those, how we promote debate and discussion through those, and how that comes down to a community level as well as a that slightly higher level, where administrative level, where the community can engage. So you're absolutely right.
But I was thinking about the pilots at the moment. They're being asked, of the regional land use partnerships, are being asked to look at 3 specific topic areas, and landscape sort of slots into natural capital. So it's not necessarily the best way to have a conversation with a community of that scale of landscape around natural capital. So it's not, well, from my perspective, I don't think it's working in the way that we would like it to work. Yeah,
kind of on that floor, but I personally agree, and there'll be dragons, but also we can fight the dragons.
Stuart.
If I could just pick up on that, Rachel, Stuart Brooks, National Trust for Scotland. So, National Trust for Scotland did a full baseline natural capital assessment across its entire landed estate. And we specifically asked the researchers, and this was a really good team that we worked with, the Dieter Helm's natural capital research team. And so we started to explore the methodology around natural capital valuation of landscape. And it was very deficit, actually. It was really quite weak. And this is the one area that I think as a community we do need to put some energy into, because a lot of those land use decisions are being made on the basis of valuation, carbon being one, of course, but equally biodiversity as well, and we're developing metrics for that. And I kind of worry really that landscape is just being left out and lost because it doesn't have a comparative language. The other thing that really kind of struck me in your chronology there was, I think there appears to be a kind of quite a recent gap, I suppose, in really kind of moving our understanding on, and perhaps this is the area that we really need to work with the community to develop.
I mean, just to come back on that, I completely agree, and it's finding the language. That's perhaps where that provocation was coming from in my own mind in terms of the question, is that for perfectly understandable reasons, the idea of natural capital and carbon accounting is dominant from a climate change point of view, but that only deals with one dimension of landscape or 1 or 2 dimensions of landscape. It generally misses out the people bit, and I genuinely believe that landscape is about people, and if it were only talking about natural capital accounting, we get into that cultural ecosystem services side, but there'll be more dragons. So I think that for me, I think you're absolutely right, and it's how we can have a conversation about that and look at what we can do to find ways to bring them together.
Merrick.
I just had 2 questions. Forgive me, I'm new to Scotland, so I might need to be educated. I love it, by the way. On the natural capital point, it might interest colleagues. I've just done a piece of research with FTech, and I think FTech is now advising the First Minister on natural capital accounting. But on a 1,000-hectare estate, the one that I've been working on, we projected the food production values, which is set at about 5.8 million over the next 60 years. That's net cost. But the net cost of natural capital was 125 million using the English government's mathematical systems. So this is a really important area that I would strongly suggest we do work on. And if anybody wants a copy of the natural capital report, you'd be very welcome to have it. I'll be very happy to share that with you. The other question I had, bearing in mind the point about whose landscape, have we got a modernised 30 by 30? What about 100 by 100?
I agree, but it's not about me. So I think we're coming on to speak about 30 by 30. I mean, for those who are, I don't know if everyone's heard of 30 by 30, so it's about 30% of Scotland's land being designated for
20.
The trouble is governments get fixed on this, and it's very misleading the way the English government have handled this, because within their 30, there are some of the most highly polluted landscapes anywhere in the country. Now the public have no idea. They're seduced immediately by 30 by 30, and it is very misleading, and we really ought to be far more ambitious.
And the only thing I would add to that is that there are different levels. So although I mentioned the land use pilots as a mechanism to try new things, and I don't know if Laura has a sort of put you on the spot, Laura, but the idea of talking about our place as a toolkit, which apart from the logos, I can't imagine will be that out of date, but using that as a way to say anybody can do this. You don't need resources to do this. Any community can take ownership of it, and that helps you with the language to participate, because half of it is about how you feel confident enough to be in the room to say, do you know what, we need houses, but you don't need to do them like that. Or we need trees, but we can do them in a different way. And it's how you bring that, you empower people to be able to join the conversation.
Yeah. There was some hands at the back, yes, please.
Thanks, thanks Sarah, really enjoyed your presentation. Stuart Lee from Engineering Scotland. My question is on your point about the peopled landscape, and I just was curious as to whether you think post-pandemic the dynamic has shifted from those who work and live in the landscapes and those that choose to visit them for recreational purposes, and what your thoughts are around that and in a post-pandemic climate.
Do you mean in a sense of tension and
that's part of it, but yeah, there are obviously opportunities around that as well in terms of tourism and the economy.
It's not something I've looked at the more recent research on. I guess from my personal perspective, there's always that balance between those who live and work on the land, and I think the likes of Magnus Davidson, for example, who talks about repeopling Scotland and how we actually have people living and working within the land as opposed to seeing it purely as a tourism element. There are obviously a lot of very political tensions within that. In my ideal dreamlike world, there's something around finding a place for everyone. So it's absolutely everyone's right to visit, but at the same time, how you then balance those rights and responsibilities with those who are living and working there. I think you're never going to remove those tensions. Perhaps one of the things I should also flag was the access legislation, which I think makes a different emphasis within Scotland than perhaps elsewhere in the UK, and also the role of the Lands Commission, trying to say in the nuts and bolts of day-to-day management, there are rights and responsibilities on landowners and managers. And so although those again sound like bureaucratic systems, on the ground, I think there are places where they are working and they're making that conversation work, and also then allowing those who are interested in that amenity value to have a place to sit down and have that conversation, so that you can try and get a balanced compromise, and each side or each interest listening to one another. So it is really about finding a place. I have no easy answer to that.
I think rights and responsibilities is the key statement there. Dylan.
Thanks, sir. I do like your list, and it's very like the list I'd probably drop myself. But I noticed there's an agriculture on it, and agriculture's, 70-80% of land use in Scotland. And my impression is in Scotland we're not very good at recognising the public value of farmed landscapes. I think in England it does it a bit better, areas of natural beauty, and better yet even in the continent, where they sort of link landscape, land use, the products of land, the history of the land. Do you have a perspective on how different countries are taking that on?
How long have you got? Sorry, you're right, and I was conscious when I was doing this list that it could not be exhaustive, and in some ways agriculture is an obvious one that's missing, bearing in mind that my day-to-day work involves a lot of how we manage agriculture and climate change. Yeah, I guess one of the dimensions in that is how we've considered the special qualities that agriculture brings to the landscape in Scotland, particularly in different parts of the country. So recently I was involved in a piece of research where the initial draft was talking about, well, we don't have enough hedgerows and we need lots more hedgerows. And we're going, well, there are different cultural traditions, there are different reasons that there are no or are hedgerows in different parts of Scotland, but then you're thinking about what is the purpose of agriculture and how has that changed over time. So I think we can probably all agree that the European agricultural policy in the 70s, 80s and 90s did some terribly dreadful things that we would never repeat now. But the question is how you then look today and say, well, if the driver is trees, we don't just stick trees somewhere. What is it about the purpose of agriculture within the landscape that brings those special qualities and how that then changes? And I mean, some of the debates which are very current are around bioenergy. Now you could argue that you could put miscanthus or short rotation coppice within the same field boundaries, and are you affecting them? Of course you are. You've got different crops, you've got different practices. But what does that mean overall in terms of agriculture's contribution to the landscape and within the biodiversity? So I guess I don't have an easy answer to that. If after a couple of pints in the pub I can rant on this one quite happily in terms of some of the key tension areas, but I think it will be interesting to see how the Scottish Government comes through the proposals they have for agriculture, which need to be, I think the bill's due next year, for how they replace CAP. And it will be different to England. I can't comment on England because every time I think I understand what's going on, they change. I don't know, I've lost track, my bad. But I think it's a very current time for everyone in that context, and the climate change side of things and biodiversity at the same time as food production and food security is making this a hugely contentious area where if we're not careful, the landscape will change simply because we've not paid attention to what those special qualities are. But that's not to say the argument is to say don't change, because we haven't a hope in saying don't change. Let's think about how that changes the land.
Which brings us back to that overall question, how do we focus on the total landscape? Originally, I think we talked in the SLA as having an overarching landscape strategy for Scotland, but as you said, the language has changed and we're heading off in different directions with a different language. So it's about how we can bring it back so that landscape becomes part of our normal language. And as Dermot in his working group forum landscape indicators said, that landscape for a lot of people is a prism, that you can look through things and identify a whole range of other aspects that affect people's lives through the landscape. And it's a very useful tool. So maybe going back to the Nature Scott publication as well, Our Place. Anyway, focusing again on that question, have we got anybody else? Rebecca?
Just a comment really, I thought it was a good chance to bring it in. As you're mentioning place, and we've been looking at scale, and I'm just thinking about the engagement issue needs to cover all scales. And there's a major change taking place just now with the local place plans introduction. Even though they're not going to be required, they're voluntarily going to be produced, but they're right across the country based on community council inputs into local LDPs. LDP2, the next phase of them, will invite all community councils to put in a local place plan that could be taken into account in their land use planning decisions, etc. going forward. and those plans will be in residence for 10 years once they're adopted. So they're quite significant at that scale.
Yeah.
And then the whole other thing that we're talking about, in a big scale of engagement, is a whole other ball game. So it's just like the engagement issue needs to be taken at many, many different levels. And there's changes in Horizon, I've just mentioned, local place plans, which will introduce the local situation, which is great, but there's no resources for it. You know, same old, but there is the opportunity. And then there's the whole other thing of the land use planning, top end of the land use management plans. And so there's a whole spectrum there of engagement.
Yeah, so scales of engagement. Nick, sorry, did you want to respond?
No, sorry.
We've got an online comment.
Oh, an online comment, and then Nick, if that's.
Yeah, so from Beryl, saying we mustn't omit to mention the huge importance of coastal landscapes, their roles in food provision, aesthetic and cultural significance, their value for recreation, their diverse habitats and biodiversity, and crucially their contribution to addressing climate issues, specifically in specific habitats such as eelgrass meadows. The latter are much depleted around the world's coastlines, none more so than around Scotland due to industrial activity and dredging.
Absolutely. There's, I can only agree with that, although I guess the thing that I would flag that's a slightly positive angle is the work of Dynamic Coast and some of the LiDAR work, particularly in the threatened areas, which gives us that baseline information. So there's often a chicken and the egg of saying we have concerns about something, but then when you sit down on a policy level, it's saying, well, what do we know either about individual areas or about the national picture? And I think some of the work of Dynamic Coast is really helping with that. And I was on a trip with Gavin McGregor earlier last month, and seeing some of the LiDAR results, which are about coastal, understanding coastal change, but the information that's coming out of that is just so exciting.
Positive, that's good. Nick, then Sue.
Yeah, I think looking back, one of the issues we've had as a nation in landscape is it's been framed as part of a discussion about planning, institutionally and in government. Landscape has been a planning matter. So as Dermot said, it's scarcely featured at all in agricultural discussions. It's scarcely featured in social policy. And I think that's the key change. And the landscape partnerships, one of the key success factors in them has been looking at it from the other end, that it's been a holistic view, social factors being really critical, habitat factors as well. And it's been a more ground up approach. I think that's really to be commended and supported, and that's perhaps the way forward. That this kind of top down approach sets challenges, because then there's that conversion of very good policy through regulation into actual delivery, and that's always where things fall down. You've got oceans of great policy, and often the policies in different parts of government, different parts of institutions, and it's bringing it together and actually delivering it.
So you're suggesting that a mechanism is really starting at the ground level and having that swell of public engagement, and it is empowerment. Because it's
finding a locus for that. So Koyak and it's a tight-knit community, very different to the inner fourth area, but they've both found different ways of approaching those.
Do you think then what Rebecca was saying about local place plans is too small? I mean, because you're talking about large areas, succinct, and I know that there are many areas that are having community involvement or buyouts of old estates, but a local place plan.
I don't know if that would work.
Yeah, dance.
Done that before.
So would that be too small, or is that enough to start maybe a kind of a bit more of an engagement at that level if they get funding for anyone to help them do it?
Yes, but I think there's also just a sort of a restructuring in the thinking of the people at the top as well, because it's got to come from both ends. But everyone talks about silos, and that
Yes.
is a thing. But I think landscape is a very holistic thing. We've got all those lists there. The challenge is that those become silos, that's people, have their particular bee in their bonnet about a particular aspect of it. And it is a more holistic view, but that needs to permeate the people at the top and also empower the people at the bottom.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I would respond to with that as well is the issue of kind of power dynamics. So there's something about how you then empower the people at the bottom, and some of that is in the language. And I am reminded of, I don't know if anyone's read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but within the first couple of pages, there is we're going to plot the Earth at 12 o'clock. Well, what do you mean? Can't do that. It's been in your local planning office for the last 15 years, you didn't look. And ultimately that captures the very essence of everybody is busy doing something. So I'm sure there are planners within the room that know they've tried to engage and they don't get anyone until at the very end the decision's made. So there's something about how, and in the role I'm in, working within government, when resources are squeezed, that makes the silos even harder because there's limited time and limited space to actually sit down and say, what am I missing? So there is something around the practices that say, how do we empower local people to ask the question, but also allow others to take a step back on some of those things. I don't think there's any easy answers with it, but the resources aren't going to come magically tomorrow. So there's something about saying, how can we use little bits here and there to get things moving and really promote those examples that have worked really well. So the areas that say, actually, this isn't just about someone who's been there for 25 years leading a group. This is a really good example of how things can come together.
Pushing that up. We had Sue and then Merrick.
Hi, I'm Sue Evans. I suppose I wanted to build on something that Sarah said a few moments ago, which is about landscape change and how we have to anticipate that there will be change. And I think the scale of pace is going to accelerate in some areas, so be it driven by climate or energy needs, changes in the types of crop that we need to grow. I think that change is inevitable. But I think it's quite hard for all of us, and particularly non-specialists, to realise how important something is until it's lost. So how do we help particularly local communities? So there are opportunities for them to be able to participate. How do we help them understand what is actually important to them in their place, in their time, so that we actually understand what we need to fight for? We can't fight for everything, and it's a bit like built heritage. We're very good at designating the absolutely critically important, but you just have to look at what's happening in the heritage world, and discussions about things might not reopen, things might be left to decline. But what's really important to most people is where they live, what's immediately around them at the day-to-day level. And I think we could do a lot to be able to take toolkits that do exist, the power of photographic competitions, all sorts of things, to be able to get people thinking about what's important to them, where they live, where they work, where they recreate.
I completely agree. I think I would want to caveat it a little by saying it's not just about what you value, but how you're prepared to see change. Because I think we often talk about local communities knowing that there can be very dynamic, united voices, but also within local communities, there are the farming community that says, well, if I'm going to make money tomorrow, it's planting miscanthus, and you might not like it, but ultimately it's that or something else. I'm grossly oversimplifying that business model, but the agricultural industry is really in flux just now with international prices, and those decisions might be made on a year-to-year basis, which won't have a dramatic change. But if you are talking about reforestation, or you're talking about green lairds trying to balance up their carbon budget, they are dramatic changes in the longer term. And there are some mechanisms, whether it was within forestry planting, where there is theoretically at least an opportunity for consultation at various stages. it's about trying to say to people, well, what do we value and what can change, and we're comfortable with that, or we're comfortable with the idea, or how we can moderate that. And I think it is about, it sounds, I don't mean sound tight, but it's about how you manage that conversation so that you don't just end up with a, I want to do this, I don't want you to do this. Because once you've got to that point, it's, yes, there might be some victories, but a lot of the time it's the compromise doesn't make the headlines, and that's actually what you want to achieve, I think. Although there will be some places where compromise is a loss, and I fully acknowledge that there are some places that are significant value that you wouldn't want substantive change.
So we can look forward to the tea fields of Perthshire.
We've just got a few more minutes left before we go for a break. So we've got Merrick. Yeah.
Thinking about scale, taking the ELC a step further and basically saying that each character area ought to be explained to the community, and management plans for each character area that begin to be the statutory focus for public, private and voluntary investment.
That's provocative.
I know it is.
And my only response to that is not for me to respond, but I suppose because I've been covering some of this stuff, you then place a lot of power on those who define what a character area is. And having come from the historic environmental community, and there will be others from the biodiversity community, how do you decide you have a knowledge base that says that is the character and that's what we value and that's what doesn't change? I think the value in understanding character of areas is to help along those conversations. Sorry.
Well, I would just remind you that obviously character is based upon the interaction, human activity on the natural characteristics. Therefore, its biodiversity is critical to that. Its soil type is critical to that. Its microclimate is critical when we're talking about, changes in weather patterns, which are incredibly important to this agenda. So it just seems that we've got to try to find a way of integrating what has made that character, because all the things we value has made that character. And if you can build an understanding amongst the local community, then build a vision for integrating all these topics, and then have a management plan over a period of time for each character. That's the right scale. And of course, it then enables a breakdown of that scale for particular settlements. Settlements are critical to character. The historic landscape is an incredibly important ingredient. In fact, you could say that the character, originally the character map in England anyway, I can't speak for Scotland, was a joint map by the Countryside Agency. It's a map, not a plan, by the way, Countryside Agency and English Nature originally. But actually there was been a very good argument to have had historic England in there, or English heritage, so that you capture culture as well as the natural features. It just seems that we've got to move this agenda forward. We've got to take a lead, try to help integrate the multifunctional aspects of land which we're now facing. And it's as you rightly said, this is a really important moment in time. We've got to get this right.
It would be really interesting to pilot that.
Yeah.
I would really be interested in seeing how that works.
It'd be interesting to see how that would overlay with the regional land use partnership areas, character areas. I don't know. Ooh, 2 more questions coming up. I think gentleman there.
Thanks. Kevin Lafferty, Paths for All. Two comments, question, I suppose. There's probably higher awareness now than there's ever been in relation to nature connectedness and the importance and value, and also the awareness that people care for the environment, but they don't know what to do to take action. So I think there's an opportunity at a local level in localism to encourage people to take action, and I suppose in a sense, not to lose that opportunity by not doing anything about it. And then, the second question is, we haven't really talked about land ownership and the transparency that we need in Scotland. This is one of the things that's really holding us back. And that's not, we're not having that public debate. It's in the background amongst professionals. We need to bring that out into the open and actually be honest, who owns and who influences the landscape in Scotland. It's a very small pool of people and agencies. So let's have a public debate about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sarah Franklin from Historic Environment Scotland. This is probably more of a question. I'm trying to sort of reconcile myself with the question, how can we balance different interests? We've heard a lot about compromise and about people having to say that sort of thing. And I'm looking at the list there, thinking, does compromise lead to mediocrity, for example? And I'm just thinking of, like the Edinburgh World Heritage Site and the emoji poo thing, and, that sort of stuff. Do we end up with this compromise that isn't the best of anything? And then does that bring us back to debate possibly about designations and how that world works and stuff? I don't know, I'm just throwing it out.
It's a very good question, and I don't have an answer beyond saying, part of my career was as an inspector of ancient monuments, so I was right in there, but also recognising where in fact it was good for us to be challenged. So I think it's a very good question, and there's a question of then how as a society or a community, or are the mechanisms there and they're just not applied correctly, or are the mechanisms there saying, well, actually, ultimately we did everything we could, and this was the result. What do we learn from it? So, yeah, completely.
Because one person's compromise is another person's multifunction.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I'm
Yeah.
just not being able to function. No, it's an interesting bit because I'm thinking from the other perspective about scenery as well, and about man's influence on scenery, grazing sheep farm and that sort of thing. And Scotland is famed for its scenery. That's why people come in the millions to visit it every year and stuff. So I'm just trying to internally answer the question, which I'm really struggling to do.
Yeah.
A couple of questions online, and then we're going to stop for a break.
Yep, we've got a comment from Michael Brown from the British Geological Society. I think that's right, Michael. Hopefully it is. Saying landforms geology. Yep, landforms and geology are an integral part of landscape. I hope this is not forgotten. And then an easy question to end on from Tom Martin, saying, Sarah, do you have any thoughts on the balance between protecting wildland and investing in renewables in light of NPF4?
Well, the simple answer, I think, is none of these questions are, none of it's straightforward. Having worked with the carbon calculator for wind farms on peatland, I am conscious of the political and wider tensions within these conversations. So I'm not going to give you an easy answer, but I think you have to look up where special qualities can be identified, and also recognising that if you say there are no wind turbines at all in any wildland areas, where do they go, or what are the mechanisms? Now, actually, there are lots of forms of renewable energy that we could be exploring in other ways, but I would also say that 2030 isn't that far away, 2045 is our net zero target. There are hard decisions here. So don't get me wrong, I am not saying you must put them in wildland, you must not, but I think none of this stuff is easy, and I'm glad I'm not the minister making the decisions on that.
But we can use landscape as a tool to encourage that discussion
and to encourage the highest standard that you can get. So use it for a positive conversation, not a definitely or not definitely not. So it's what are the parameters for that conversation?
Yeah.
On that, can I just add a little item which of interest, which is very much about this. In East Lothian, where I'm based, there is now a proposal to get together all the community councils with the wind energy developers, so that all community benefits from each proposal go into a common pot for the whole county, not just for individual community councils affected by a particular development. Because it seems that some community councils have difficulty finding how to spend the money that they're actually allocated on the development proposal. So there's a way forward there so to actually integrate renewable energy, the direction towards net zero, along with land use decision making, community involvement, and some money to do it. Just as it's in sort of early stages, but
there's so much more to say on that, but Rachel's given me the eye for the timing, so happy to explore that later another time.
Okay, well, listen, I think that's been a really interesting discussion on that question posed by Sarah. So I want to thank everyone who's participated, and sorry if there's any other questions that we've not got to. But also thank you very much to Sarah for fielding that debate really very effectively, and also giving us that really good introduction to the timeline of the European Landscape Convention in Scotland.
We're going to go from, I guess, the bigger picture and the historical chronology and kind of focus down now into three areas. So these three areas, I think, I guess they don't fully span the kind of breadth of kind of interest and values and impacts that are bearing down on landscape, but I think they give us a kind of a good spread nonetheless. I think they also, particularly when we come on to talking about the national parks and human rights to a healthy environment, also maybe present us with some opportunities about how we manage some of the issues and impacts that Sarah's talked about. So the way that we're going to run this is that I'm going to invite up our speakers one by one, and we're going to start with Dermot Hearns, who's the head of public policy, risk and environment. Is that right, Dermot? I should know that. At the National Trust for Scotland. And we've asked Dermot to cover, I think, kind of a bit of a hospital pass here, but in the context of landscape, look at climate change and biodiversity. So Dermot's going to kind of run through that, and then we'll open up the discussion, and then we'll move on to our next speaker and do the same, and then our third speaker. Okay, so I invite Dermot to come and introduce biodiversity and climate change.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Show the camera's jumping that. Yeah. I've got a magic TV for those that aren't in the room that can tell where you are, where you're talking from. Seems very appropriate to talk about climate change in this temple of steam, cathedral of carboniferous calamity, the great age of coal, which we're dealing with. So cover two topics very quickly in 5 minutes: climate challenge and biodiversity crisis, and the kind of impacts on the landscape. So to begin with, the kind of anticipated changes that we're looking at from various projections, models, which range from good to very bad, depending how well the global community responds to it and reduces emissions. So temperature in Scotland, perhaps 1 to 3 degrees increase over the next 50 years. Storms, when it gets warmer, the earth can hold more water, so storms become more severe. So expecting greater storm damage. Flooding from downpours, but also from sea level rise, perhaps between 20 and 40 centimetres sea level rise over the next 50 years. Drought, getting quite biblical. So despite all this increased rainfall, also expecting dry periods, particularly in the summer, between 10 to 20% more dry periods in Scotland. And then geological instability, which is often perhaps overlooked. We've been looking at this in our own work on the National Trust for Scotland estate. But it's forecast for greater slope failure and also for soil upheaval. So the actual physical underpinnings of the landscape, as it were, the geological basis of the landscape, is also going to be subject to stresses. And all of that's going to bring about change to the landscapes. And it's important to note that these changes are going to happen regardless of what we as humans do. This is just nature responding to changed environments, different species, different habitats responding to changed circumstances. So for example, in terms of Scotland's moorland or heather moorland, you expect to perhaps see that being displaced by increased grassland that start to push into it. In terms of tree species, we'd expect to see beech and sycamore being more predominant, and again sort of pushing out oak. So these things are going to happen just as nature responds to kind of changed conditions, and also affects cultural landscapes. For example, National Trust for Scotland looks after Culloden Battlefield, which is a relatively intact moorland landscape, but increasingly we're having small tree growth pushing up through it, which we then have to fight against, and I have to say they're doing better than the jackites ever did. But so all these landscapes are going to be subject to natural change as a result of these shifting circumstances. So the human response comes in 2 parts. I mean, the first one is mitigation. So that's us trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce the severity of climate change. In Scotland, sort of 2 notable examples. Peatland was mentioned, and perhaps that's a relatively benign, neutral landscape change, restoring peatlands. But one major driver in Scotland is going to be carbon sequestration, so increased woodland planting, looking to get forest cover in Scotland up to 21%. And a lot of that will be commercial planting, cropping, rotation, the landscape impacts that go with that. And other than mentioned already is renewable energy, looking probably at another wave, pardon the pun, of renewable energy, 8 to 12 gigawatts perhaps over the next period, which is equivalent to what we've had. Again, some of that will come to repowering, so taking existing sites with a bigger turbine. That particular one's in Germany. It's 254 metres from blade tip to ground. 200 metres is commonly being proposed now for onshore wind development in Scotland. And there's a proposal down in Lanarkshire, I believe, for 260 metres. So these are quite big structures. And alongside the structures comes the power lines. So quite big landscape impacts coming from mitigation. And I think it's important to say that government's creating a framework for these decisions, but it's private owners, private developers that are making decisions what goes where, when. And the second major phase is the adaptation. So as I mentioned, flooding, slope failure. We're going to have to do quite a lot of adaptation, hard infrastructure just to maintain services as they are at present. But we'll also see a human response to those changing circumstances. So we'll probably see changes to what we plant, how we plant it. We mentioned dry periods, so more irrigation coming. So the actual physical form of how humans manage the landscape will also change to take advantage of it. And all of this is happening in an already stressed natural environment. We have agricultural use, increased use of pesticides over decades. We have habitat fragmentation from urban development and road development. And this is taking decades and decades to bite away at our natural environment. And it's only now we're sort of seeing the bill for it coming due. I mean, to give you an idea of what it means for Scotland, one measure of biodiversity is the Biodiversity Impactness Index, and Scotland scores 212 out of 240 countries. So despite being a relatively low density populated country, our biodiversity is not in good shape. And if we were a European Union member state, we'd rank about 23rd out of 27 member states in terms of biodiversity quality. So despite being relatively open, relatively green, our biodiversity is not in good shape. So the solutions to the nature crisis, it's encouraging to see government pick this up, that it's now recognised much more in policy documents. So for example, the National Planning Framework 4 talks about nature recovery. The national park, the idea of a third national park for Scotland is very much predicated around nature recovery. So these are good news. The interesting part, I think, is that it's also seen as being a market opportunity now, that we're now offsetting for carbon, which we're familiar with, but also biodiversity offsetting, which is more developed in England, but is coming in Scotland. So the idea that if you're degrading or damaging biodiversity in one area, you can offset it in another. And that's quite a kind of top-down approach to it, really. What's going to get planted where to kind of recreate a habitat in whose terms, and it's quite a lot of corporate interest. I mean, land reform's been mentioned. There's some concern from the Scottish Landscape Commission, Scottish Land Commission, Scottish Land Commission about corporates buying up land in Scotland purely to offset activities elsewhere around the globe. So that's going to have an impact. And another big emphasis in government is on connectivity. So the idea of nature networks, of green corridors linking areas of high nature value. Again, quite a kind of positive approach, but again, not really thought of in landscape terms. It's very much a kind of functional biodiversity thing. And I think overall in that debate, I think that's what strikes me about it, is that biodiversity is taking precedence over landscape. These things are very much framed in sort of measurable biodiversity, and the less tangible perhaps, or the less easily to articulate landscape qualities aren't really being seen. So I was asked to conclude with a provocative question, and it's that, I mean, what is the room for landscape in all of this? At best we talk about landscape scale, that occurs phraseology occurs quite a lot in these discussions, but landscape itself, landscape quality, landscape management, landscape values don't tend to appear. We do have designated landscapes, and those act as a kind of filter in some of these developments, national scenic areas, national parks and so on, but it's a bit like squeezing a balloon. You know, if the development doesn't happen in one place, it happens in another, like Dumfries and Galloway. So what can the landscape community do? Can we be a positive voice for these changes? Can we try and join some of these things together? Or are we going to be a kind of lone voice in the face of all these developments? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dermot. Okay, so Dermot's ended on a question, I think, to us, and also to people online. Hopefully you can all hear us. So it would be good, as well as kind of any questions, I think if we can also kind of share some ideas about how we kind of move this kind of connected agenda forward. Nick, I think, termed or used a term of phrase earlier on about oceans of disconnected policy. So I think Dermot's presentation there, you know, really ably, I think, kind of set out what the broad kind of scope of these disconnected policy areas could be. So I'm particularly keen to kind of hear any ideas about how we might be able to put landscape at the centre of that and kind of move things on. Yeah.
I don't think it responds to that, I'm afraid, but I'm Kat, I'm the new director of APRS when John maybe stepped down.
Okay.
I come from a biodiversity background, that's where I've worked my entire career, apart from a couple of years in climate. So I kind of really, this is where I feel comfortable in this area. And someone did mention 30 by 30 earlier, and I wanted to kind of bring it into this context because one of the big, within the conservation community at least, there's a lot of opposition to the inclusion of landscape designations within the 30 by 30 because they don't have objectives for biodiversity, for example, national scenic areas, national parks. However, our government wants to feel that they're doing really well, and so they add them in because they are vast areas, but there are no management sort of things in there. So I wanted to ask the landscape community how they feel about that, because there's a huge pushback coming from conservation organisations to get all of that taken out, and obviously that creates tension. And so I just wanted to throw this in there. My view is 30 by 30 is a biodiversity objective, and so it needs to be backed up with biodiversity designations. And actually the research is showing, a big paper in Nature showed that actually designations don't really contribute to biodiversity, it's the management of those areas. So if it's not designated but it's managed really well for biodiversity, that's great. But if it's designated but nobody cares, then it doesn't. So it is actually a little bit of box ticking. Anyway, can I throw it out there for the landscape? Your ways of thinking.
I'd say it's a positive initiative overall, but that is recognised that it's not enough just to designate, you have to manage. And it's the same in the marine environment where we now have a network of marine protected areas, which is great, but we've only got as far as the designation, you still have to put in place the management approach you want to take, and then beyond that the enforcement part. So there's still quite a chain of activity to happen to deliver it. And there's certainly agreement amongst the environmental NGOs that the 30 by 30, you can't just say a designated area like a national scenic area, you have to have a management plan. And in England, the equivalent areas of natural beauty do have management plans and are being counted towards the English target. The NSAs in Scotland aren't, not yet. And I think it's interesting the EU NGOs are also looking at the national parks quite critically, that it's not enough to say a national park, that's a protected area, therefore it's good. It's saying actually within the national parks there's good and bad and it needs to be better managed. So I think the NGOs are casting quite a critical eye on it. You know, don't get fooled again kind of thing, but yeah, it's not enough to designate, it has to be managed.
Yeah, does anybody else want to respond to that?
I think we should get behind it. I think this is all about problem management.
Yeah. So get behind the idea of including landscape but having it better managed.
Yeah. Having a set of objectives, management objectives, part of those areas. If you want to include them, there has to be specific objectives managing them, including biodiversity, obviously. So, yeah.
So, Mary, you made this point earlier on, I think. And
that's what I was trying to say.
Is that on the basis of some experience of seeing it happen elsewhere?
Yes. Darren, I admit this. I'm involved in the elm development in England at the moment, and I've done 2 national pilots. What we're looking at is a change in governance, because at the moment, frankly, the governance is appalling in England. I won't say that about Scotland, but in England it is shocking. All these silos, we've talked about silos today already. This is a classic issue of silos, you know, and it's not even as if our pursuit of biodiversity is correct at the moment. If I can just give you an example, we haven't really talked about soils, which I think is incredibly important. We in England, they're spending hundreds of millions of pounds gardening for individual species. Well, that's a nonsense if you don't think about starting with the microbial content of the soil. But that is absolutely critical. And you can drive your fertility by getting the microbial content in a consortium to work collaboratively with whatever land use you're trying. And just to talk about, you know, I mention that where I am in Perthshire, we just lost 2 big farms bought by the Dutch for the carbon market. Actually, had they thought about the carbon content of soils, and in fact, in terms of building resilience, we're really going to have to focus upon the carbon content of soils. It's a real asset in terms of food production, but also in terms of sequestration. And the one farm I'm working on, they're sequestrating 128 tons of carbon per hectare. That is double anything of the neighbouring farms. And in Scotland, you've got a fabulous opportunity. You can sequestrate a lot more carbon in your soils. So just giving way to trees because we think trees are the right answer, you know, we're going to be losing good productive food, and food security is going to be a massive issue. But you can deliver it in terms of getting the microbial content of the soils, which is the starting point in terms of transforming nature recovery and biodiversity. And really, the flagship point that I make is that actually the answer to biosecurity is biodiversity. And that is a really critical point, because this pursuit of monoculture has caused huge damage and is totally unnecessary. Sorry.
No, it's interesting about that cartoons from 1940, but the green belts are just post-war, and partly that's a landscape features that scenery is about containing urban expansion, but it's also about preserving the best quality soils. I mean, cities tend to happen where there's good quality land. We can't just lose all that to housing and urban development, and we've lost sight of it. And again, it seems to be a bit of a crimp in development, a bit of a kind of holding us back. Actually, it's there for a very good reason, including food security. And I think, you know, Ukraine's an awful tragedy, but at least it might help us rethink about what does sustainability look like.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Nick, come on. Can we just ask the audience to speak up as well, because so everybody can hear.
Nick Bowen, I'm a landscape architect. I think the Ukraine thing is very instructive, as was COVID. In effect, we got a glimpse of what it's like to onshore our demands on the landscape, which we've been relying on offshoring that to Spain and France and everywhere else for our leisure. And Ukraine has shown us what it's like to offshore our food security, and what's happening in terms of the cost of food on the global market. We really having to go back to the 1940 mindset of what can we do ourselves again, and that's a really it's opened up a real opportunity for discussion about the landscape, of what we ask of it and what we define as value. What value do we get from the land, and how hard are we working the land for the things we want from it. I don't mean hard as in bearing down it. I just mean, we should be asking more of our land generally. Land banks are very high, and there's huge wastage of land.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the concern with the offsetting move, is that you've got quite deep-pocketed owners coming, as it were, just to buy land for a single purpose. I mean, as a landowner in National Trust of Scotland, we work with the Scottish Land Commission for a long time now, and part of their concern is that we don't get too monocultural by heritage, that it's not just there for recreation, scenery, and enjoyment, that if there's social economic productivity that can happen on that land, that should be encouraged too. And we've kind of taken that on board. So some of the properties like Canna, you've got not just the historic part of it, but you've got a working farm, you've got holiday accommodation, you've got other things. And I think the concern is that corporate owners are going to come in from outside and in a way treat Scotland as we've treated other parts like Spain to get the vegetables and Algeria to get our fruit. That Scotland becomes a kind of monoculture to offset things. And in doing that, that kind of removes the community interest. So yeah, these are really live debates about what is land for and who's it for. Yeah.
I just respond to Kat's point earlier on as well. So this was a point that the SLA made from its outset, really, that we really needed to re-engage, I suppose, landscape, with the biodiversity agenda, and it had been disconnected. And I think there's a number of reasons why we need to make the point, but one of them, I think, from our perspective, is that landscape is where people encounter nature. And I think to divorce it in policy terms kind of doesn't really kind of recognise the kind of true value of that to people. And I think if we can take this kind of broader integrated approach, now it comes naturally to National Trust for Scotland because it was always part of our DNA, but it isn't always necessarily from the kind of spectrum of NGOs certainly, or actually our public body does have dual responsibility for landscape and biodiversity. So I think that's going to continue to be, I think, a kind of core message from the SLA. So we need to integrate biodiversity and the landscape agenda from the policy perspective, because actually I think that's how people see it, and we kind of need to reconnect that. Okay, I think thank you very much, Dermot. Great stuff. I'm just going to introduce our second speaker now. So our second speaker is Dr. Shivali Byfield, and she's the Chief Officer of the Environmental Rights Centre in Scotland. So the ERCS is a relatively new voice, I think, on the scene. So the ERCS was established in 2020. I think it came out Scottish Environment Link.
We did.
If I'm right. Okay. Well, maybe you're going to explain this to us anyway. But Shivali's going to talk to us about, I think, the opportunity that might exist for improvement of the legal frameworks which underpin our environmental rights. So, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and hello to everybody online as well. So thank you, Stuart, for my introduction. We are the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, and we were established in 2020. And our vision is a Scotland where every person's right to live in a healthy environment is respected, protected, and fulfilled. So I'm going to give you a top-level overview of what we mean by environmental human rights and why they matter. And I hope you'll find connections with how your own work can support the development of the human rights so that we can all address the interconnected challenges of social, environmental and climate justice. And already when I've been listening to the conversations there, thinking, that's why we need the Human Rights Bill, that's why we need the Human Rights Bill. So I hope you'll engage with my energy on this. So I'm going to start by reminding all of us, because I know we know it, but it's helpful sometimes to connect the dots, of the significant, or what we call substantive, environmental problems in Scotland. And as we know, there were some areas of highest deprivation where the majority of polluting factories, landfill, incinerators, and other environmental burdens are located. And the impacts on place, as we know, are air, water, and noise pollution, proximity to directly lived land, reduced environmental quality. And across Scotland, there's been a reduction in local authority spending on environmental services by 16% in the past decade. And of course, this contributes to the decrease in open space management, affecting perceptions of safety. Now, I think that economic issue is really important, isn't it? We can talk as much as we like about engagement and policy, but we need the money directed to make the change. So we know that the poor environments we live in contribute to inequalities in health. And in spite of the research which emphasises the psychological and social importance of access to the outdoors, our landscape, the interconnectedness that we have with the outdoors, there is spatial inequality in access to green space and nature. So that's people and place-based deprivation. What about individual people? Well, these environmental stresses are felt by everyone, but they have a greater burden on children, older people, people with existing health problems. And its impacts are exacerbated for marginalised groups, particularly disabled people, women, and people from Black and minority ethnic communities living in poverty. Marginalised groups are also more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as severe weather events, because we often have fewer resources at our disposal, and we have fewer social networks at times for respite. And all of these things are what we call distributional environmental injustice. So that's a substantive problem. And let's consider green space, urban green space. We all know about urban green space. In spite of the policy rhetoric, spend on parks and open spaces has reduced in real terms by 41% in the last decade. This is a year-on-year reduction, including a 15% reduction in the most deprived councils last year, compared to a 6% reduction in the most affluent councils. So what does this happen? Well, what happens is it coincides with downward trends in satisfaction ratings, perceptions of places to play, and frequency of visits to green space in the most deprived neighbourhoods. So we can't talk about community engagement unless we talk about money, unless we talk about talking to people in those areas and explaining and working with them about how we change the environments that matter most to them. In our unequal society, it is imperative that we make our spaces greener and richer and nature-rich as a right for all, to mitigate health inequalities and to achieve our national outcomes. Let's talk about our national outcomes on environment, communities and health. There were sharp inequalities in accessing the outdoors during COVID. Now, these have always existed, but they were magnified in visiting green and outdoor spaces. And those inequalities were around socioeconomic, age, gender and racial inequalities. So 71% of those classed as high socioeconomic status had visited their outdoors in the 4 weeks previously, compared to just 53% in those of lower socioeconomic status. So what can we do to challenge these examples of environmental injustice? How do we exercise our rights for environmental protection, for our health and the planet's sustainability? There are laws, there are treaties, but lots of people don't really know about environmental law. And most notably, we have the Aarhus Convention for Procedural Rights. But as always, there is a major imbalance of power, Sarah mentioned power, on exercising our environmental rights. We know that marginalised groups and compounded with poverty are furthest removed from participation in local decision making. We're often less aware of our rights or simply have less capacity and resources to implement them. And access to the courts has been ruled as being prohibitively expensive by the governing institutions of the Aarhus Convention. We are already breaking the law in Scotland. This results in poor enforcement of planning and nature conservation law. Because of significant barriers to public interest litigation like cost and awareness, there is no credible threat of a legal challenge to encourage the rule of law. And the consequences is the destruction of the environment and nature. And all of this hinders our obligations to address the climate emergency. And these are the issues of what we call procedural environmental injustice. Oh yes, you do. Yes, do admit that person.
Sorry, it's very close to.
Thank you. Thank you. But there is good news, which is not all doom and gloom. On the 28th of July 2022, so just a few months ago, the United Nations General Assembly declared access to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment as a universal human right. And that environmental damage has negative implications for the effective enjoyment of all human rights for present and future generations. Now, this is the first new universal human right adopted in 70 years. It's huge. And after much advocacy from a lot of the NGOs, a lot of rights-based organisations, we were delighted that the Scottish Government have committed to including the human right to a healthy environment with both the substantive and procedural elements in the upcoming Human Rights Scotland Bill. So what does this mean? Well, the substantive right is 6 interdependent rights. It's the right to clean air, safe climate, access to safe water and sanitation, healthy and sustainable food, non-toxic environments to live, work, study and play, and healthy biodiversity and ecosystems. For the first time, we have a substantive right to a healthy environment protected in law. Now, this fundamental human right is already recognised in 80% of United Nations, but not in any nation which has common law jurisdiction. So Scotland has the potential to reprioritise policy decisions. So I think this is what some of us have been talking about this morning, but how do we tip the balance? With this right, we could reprioritise economic decisions to make more policy decisions towards mitigating climate change, environmental pollution and improving population health. So what about the procedural component? Well, as I've already said, the Aarhus Convention already has access to information, public participation and access to justice and effective remedies as part of the law. And the UK is a signatory, but we've been in breach of access to justice, Article 9.4, that access to justice must be fair, timely and not prohibitively expensive. So, whistle-stop tour of environmental human rights and why they matter. So my question to you is, what can we do to make this right enforceable and meaningful to Scotland's landscape and people? And if you'd like to find out more about what we mean, do go to our website, do sign a petition, and also we have a rights awareness and outreach worker, a free advice service, advocacy. So contact me and I can tell you more about the work we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so there's a question back to us. I think this is possibly new territory for a lot of people. And I don't think it's something that actually we addressed in our kind of foundation documentation through the SLM. Looking at Rachel now. No?
There is a point in there, yes.
Okay.
And in our last working group stuff, yeah, it is.
So how do we kind of embed this opportunity, I suppose, in our thinking? What steps could we take? Mary.
Sorry to.
That's okay.
In answer to your point about repurposing our urban environment, obviously the first thing we must ensure is that local government have a statutory obligation to deliver a landscape master plan for that settlement. And that will then cover all of those points you made. If you don't make it a statutory obligation, inevitably this sort of investment will be up against education, highways, transport, waste. So that is the first thing I feel that Scottish Government must do if it doesn't already do that. It's got to be a statutory obligation placed upon local government. And then at least this topic is going to be, seen in line with all the other statutory obligations in local government. Yeah. And the other point I'd make is that actually our children, the state of childhood now is absolutely shocking. And we could do so much in terms of experiential learning, risk-taking, making friends for life, if we actually started within our schools.
So, under the Planning Act 2016, there is a duty now to have an open space strategy, and each local authority should have a green space master plan. So I think you're absolutely right. Although there are some statutory obligations and then some good practice obligations, it is about spend. So you can have all the great designs in the world, but it's about decisions about where the budget is spent within the local authority as well.
Yeah, and I think you can have green space on people's doorstep, but the quality of the green space is the issue. It means that people don't use it because it's threatening or frightening, or it's unclean, or they don't have the right facilities for that community to want to use it.
Absolutely. And just to respond to that as well, Rachel, that within the Green Space Master Plan, it is about decisions within the local authority about where spend is given. So some of the research that I did around green space inequality in Glasgow, for example, looked at the budgets and identified that where there were going to be nature-based solutions, priority tended to be in areas of more affluent rather than the areas that were most in need of them. And similarly, where you have settlements next to derelict land, each local authority has a vacant and derelict land fund, but quite often community groups don't know the fund's there, so they don't access the funds, and then that fund is just sat, and at the end of the year it's spent on other things.
Okay, we've got a couple of hands up in the room. So let's go first, and then Sarah. And can I just also remind our delegates online, I think you can speak to us, so if you want to ask a question, Please put your hand up, your little virtual hand, and we'll come to you next.
Yeah, Kevin Lafferty, Pastoral, just to say thanks for the presentation. It's really good and thought-provoking. I think I would endorse and support your call, absolutely. I think this is a long-standing inequality in Scotland. I think, you know, the vacant and derelict land register shows these sites have been on the books for 30, 40 plus years. We only have to go to the northeast of Glasgow to see these spaces and actually say, why are we not addressing this and investing in these areas? So, but I also think there's an important opportunity here. There was a lot of discussion around, I suppose, justice at COP27 and about the direction of the money and the investment that's going to be made in this area. So if we have a plan actually to how we can utilise and direct that money, potentially we can address some of these long-standing injustices and issues. And also just to say that, you know, all of the research that was done during the COVID highlighted that inequity and quality of environment to green space. And we don't have a green space standard to say if you live, you should have a minimum standard. So we've circled around this for a long time, you know, and I think we have got measures, but we haven't enforced that. So, you know, having a standard that we try and hold ourselves to account on would be really good.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I love pastoral, and I know Rona well. We have this opportunity now with the National Performance Framework. The national outcomes are in process of being reviewed. The national outcome for communities is access to green space. The indicator is access to your local nearest green space should be less than 5 minutes walk away. There's no standard and quality, you're absolutely right. So all of that is up for grabs. I mean, that's just one of many, but absolutely let's get behind revisiting those national performance outcomes to make them work for us.
Sarah?
Thanks, it was really thought-provoking for me because in some ways the human rights angle is absolutely embedded, but we don't tend to think of it as the lens for landscape, and I think there's a challenge there for us to do that. I guess I want to be challenging to the room, not necessarily to yourself, that everything you have said I completely agree with, and everything that we would think are some of the solutions are what we would agree to do, but ultimately local government has been starved of funds for the last 15 to 20 years. I don't expect those within government roles to respond to this. I just feel that I'm in a position to be able to say that. So we put all the burden on local government, whether that's in terms of implementing the planning system or trying to then agree standards that can then be monitored. And there's simply no resource within the local authority to do that. So there's kind of two prongs in the sense where I think we have to accept that if we want the standards of that, the resource has to come from somewhere. And if it's not coming through the public purse, how do we find innovative ways to do that, to then hold people to account or to encourage other private sector bodies who are doing the development to say, well, it's in your interest to do this in terms of the bottom line. You know, think more widely than the bottom line. So I just wanted to introduce I apologise, a depressing note there, but we can't expect planners and local governments to do everything because right now they're trying to work out what to do with Granny in the hospital, and I can kind of understand why they're prioritising that. But maybe that's incumbent on us to think about as we move through the political processes in the next 2 or 3 years. What are the practical things we can say to politicians, this is what you can do, that isn't just you need to give more money. It could be becomes the end result, but what are those practical things we can think about in terms of human rights, environment, deprivation that can make a tangible difference on the ground, which I think is a question.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know, this is a topic that I think we've tried to recognise as a landscape community. And you know, it kind of struck me going back to your chronology, Sarah, that I think this community in the past has spent a lot of time thinking about natural landscapes in remote places and trying to understand the value of those. But actually, this is really kind of brings it home because it's directly affecting the longevity of people's lives. So I think we need to possibly recalibrate, I suppose, the emphasis that we place on value in landscape. And kind of bring this much more to the fore. So this feels like a kind of great opportunity.
And I agree, and I think that word recalibration is really helpful. This doesn't need more money. It needs redistribution of money. It needs a rebalancing of priorities. And I think that when I've spoken to planners and local authorities in terms of green space master plans, these are the opportunities of working with local folk to identify the priorities for them. I'm a little bit cynical about the local place plans as a planning tool, because quite often when people have used them, they've had fantastic ideas and then nothing's been done about it. So it's also about managing expectations. But if we start with a budget of what we have got and then ask what can we do with it, but then a lot of the things that we're asking for don't actually take very much money, especially if you've got vacant derelict funds somewhere that aren't being used. And it is about that RHS conventions, public participation in local decision making. If you ask the questions that matter to people, people will give you the answers, as we all know.
All right, last word.
No, and I was also thinking, a redistribution of money, yes, but also other opportunities are around energy creation in our public spaces, carbon sequestration, food growing. These are all opportunities that make money that could be put into those spaces, along with, you know, using the vacant derelict land fund correctly or redistributing money. That's my last word. Okay, thank you. All right, thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our third speaker now. Our third speaker is Rebecca Hughes. So through the Butte House Agreement, we know that the Scottish Government has committed to designation of at least one new national park in the lifetime of this current Parliament. And national parks, as we know, are places where we could potentially, in theory, see this kind of integration of public benefits, including landscape. So over to you, Rebecca, and I think this is an opportunity that we're...
Yeah, thanks very much. And hello everyone. Some of you I know from way time back and some more recently, but great to be able to give you a bit of an update and ask you some pretty knotty questions about what could happen, what might happen. We've got a timeline there. I'm not going to go through it because you probably know it. The first 7 items we've got a deadline tomorrow of public consultation responses by midnight tomorrow night. So if you haven't done yours yet, I hope you have a chance to put it through, because the more responses we have, the better. I just have put I've only got 5 minutes and there's a huge amount I could be covering. And I'm only allowed 3 slides, and I'm actually, as you can tell, using my voice as well. So hence the water. But I have some questions for you. Stuart mentioned the Butte House Agreement. That was a magic moment. And we don't want to let it go. They said in that agreement at least one new national park. And we're going to hold them to that, because we feel that there is room for more considerations, a wider agenda, potentially different ways of doing things, and so many other items I could mention. But I think in terms of what we've got here, the SLA, as we are caucus today, have a place on the steering advisory group for the consultation. And that is ongoing, and there will be more meetings. The public consultation is happening now, as I mentioned, finishing tomorrow, the 30th of November. But we also have, within SLA, we have 3 organisations that also have a place at that table of that advisory group. And that is APRS, who I'm representing here today, the SCNP, it's a project that's grown out of APRS, and LINC, who are also represented here today, which is great. And we have particular items we're trying to really push forward that we're concerned about. And we also include HES in that environment, because we've had discussions about the cultural dimension and where that is on the agenda of this new national park. Now, the first part of that list is the non-statutory part of the process. The third items, 1, 2 and 3 at the bottom, are the statutory stages. And we're going on into that very soon next year. I understand that Nature Scot will be giving advice back to Scottish Government by the end of January. Is that correct, Peter? Yep. So very short time span, and that is also an issue for us generally is that this whole thing is being done in quite a condensed timeline. We're having less time for consultations, less time to discuss, so we've really got to move at a pace. So, as we have it, there is another item which I have to bring up, which I've been asked to bring up, my colleagues that I work with in the RS. There is a natural environment bill, which could be used to change primary legislation, but it's not due until 2024. So any new national parks will have to be designated under the existing legislation if it's going to happen within the bounds of this Scottish Government term, which finishes in May 2026. Otherwise, there's not enough time to do the machinations of legislative change. So that's a key item. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. So, coming back to that thing about legislation amendments, my question to you is, does the Act really need to be amended? Or could the desired greater focus on nature and climate be achieved more simply by ministerial direction or policy statement? And that might be an antipathy to what we've been saying earlier, because we want landscape and cultural dimensions to be considered more fully and more overtly in whatever guidance comes through, because of the interest we've mentioned already this morning on the nature and biodiversity topics being seemingly front-loaded. But I have a question for you, because it came up at a meeting I was at a week or so ago, and that where we're at the moment is just a point in time. Where we might be, say, in 20 or 40 years' time, might be quite different again. So let's not lose the baby with the bathwater by saying, no, biodiversity, climate change. We have to go along with it. It's the big buzzword of the moment. It's the big where the push is where there's resources. And we just have to, I think, model around. This is my opinion, but I'm happy to be challenged. But there is this whole issue about, I was at a wind farm consultation 10 days ago, and I queried the developers about what was on the table, what was going to be community benefits, etc., etc. And I said, so when you come back round for a new generation of wind turbines, we've gone from 7 metres to now over a 200-metre height to tip. Where are we going to be with the next generation of wind turbines? They said, well, you know what? We don't think there will be any wind turbines in 40 years' time. Now, that is a huge issue, because I have had, and I don't know if Mark's there online, but Mark Van Grieken, who's very much involved in this topic, he thinks there should be wind turbines in national parks and there should be any control over whether they're in or out or are not allowed here, there, ever, because we need as many as we can get. But I'm being told by a developer that they think the technology of energy generation, carbon neutral energy generation, will be in another era in 40 years, or less maybe. So the things we're considering now as major issues might not be. So we have to think much more coherently and further forward than we think we are at the moment, not get too hung up about the biodiversity and nature challenges and crises. Climate change is happening whether we like it or not. Biodiversity issue is also one, but we need to think more holistically, dare I use that word, about how landscape can fit in around that agenda, which is right up there at the top of priorities at the moment. Okay, another question that comes out of this list is, how can public bodies, other than national park authorities, better support national park aims? I'm thinking about organisations such as Transport Scotland, enterprise agencies, local councils. My next question, how much time have I got? I have my 5 minutes yet.
You've got a couple of minutes. You've got a minute. Yeah, right.
So the other question is about coastal and marine. There's a lot of work done on coastal marine national parks back in 2006-07. There was a major amount of work which could have been really useful. We could bring it forward and be looking at that again. I'm sure people will say that we are possibly going to be looking there too. My fifth question is, should national park authorities have development planning and development management powers, as in Lowland and Trossachs, or just the former, which is as in Cairngorm National Park? Those two national parks, the only two we have. In 20 years, we've had only two national parks defined in Scotland. They don't have the same powers. So is there a range of possibility of having another flavour of national park format working, what it's covering, what it's doing? And lastly, my question is about the cultural landscape, how we can better inform or guide the interests that must be party to the picture of a new national park. And we will say at least one new national park. There may be others. There may be a list. Is there going to be a list of a wish list or a wish list of different ways of doing things in national park settings or designation? So that's my 6 questions from this particular one for you. But bear in mind that wind farm point that's made by a developer. And I think there was something in that. It struck a chord with me. I thought, yes, I've seen these things move so fast over time. Where might they go next? Might they be off the map altogether? And it won't be an issue of landscape change. It's just one item of landscape change, but it's one that's significant because at the moment they're outside. They're not allowed inside national parks. Can we afford to still say that? Or should we be saying that still? Okay, next slide. My last one is just a picture for you. I think it's just really a historical one because this was 2013. So it's 10 years old next year. We see the areas of interest and they still are quite valid. Ben Nevis, Glencoe, Black Mount, the Cheviots, Coastal and Marine National Park centred on Mull, Galloway, Glenafric, Isle of Harris, part of, Wester Ross. And that was in 2013. These were suggested by APRS and SCMP in a document which I'm sure many of you have seen. That's still available on the APRS website if you want to have a look at it, SCMP website, should I say, now. Since then, since 2017, there's been some lively local campaigns, Borders and Galloway, community up initiatives that have come forward, and they've got quite a long way in deciding how and where and what they would like to do. There's other interest areas. In Argyll, there's the Blue Marine Foundation. I think it also was the local council at one stage wanting to have a national park in Argyll. And there's also Loch Arbor Nevis partnership with NTS. So there's other things happening. This was back then, this is 10 years old. These are still relevant, but there'll be other ways of doing them. And also, I think we've got a situation of the Scottish Government is wanting to do a lot of consultation on where these areas may be desired to be by the communities. There has been 3 consultations, I believe, so far, one in the north, one in the centre and one in the south to discuss the national park consultation response, and there'll be others. So it's a question of, so how do you arrive at where and who should have a voice in that? So that's all my questions. I think that's probably enough to be going on with.
Okay, why don't we just flick back to the previous screen and just have them up. Okay, so reactions, responses or questions, Sarah?
Shed loads of stuff in there. I just have a very quick technical question. So you pointed out that Loch Lomond, the Trossachs and Cairngorms have different planning curves. Has there been any form of analysis or assessment of how that's operated for the last sort of 15 years? I'd be really interested in whether someone's done research to say, this is where we started, this is where we are now, here's examples of how it worked and how it didn't work and what we've learned from that. It feels good to know someone's done that.
Yeah, I don't know. I pass on to Pete or possibly Laura for any feedback on that item.
I think the simple answer is no formal review has been undertaken. There were changes to the planning powers when the national parks were reviewed. I can't remember when now, to be honest. It was probably after 2007. So about 2010 was the last time it was looked at.
Yeah.
From a landowner's perspective, National Trust of Scotland owns a big chunk of land in the Cairngorms National Park, actually Ben Lomond as well in the other one, but we were kind of looking at quite a significant planting scheme in what is quite a sensitive landscape, and it kind of plays to the conversations we were having earlier on about how do you kind of integrate different approaches and what are the trade-offs. But my one observation is that because we were in the national park, and because the national park has a kind of dedicated kind of landscape professional, we spent much more time looking at the design of the planting scheme and trading off and satisfying the kind of various benefits. So it wasn't just about biodiversity or just about carbon. Now, we would likely have done that anyway, but I think because it was a consideration within the national park and there was somebody there, you know, a professional who had the capacity to kind of give advice but also challenge, I think led to probably a better outcome. So I think from a landowner's perspective, we saw the advantage, I think, of being in a national park in that respect.
Okay, so again,
that speaks to landscape capacity in planning authorities.
Absolutely.
And if you look back, you know, 40, it used to be town and country planning. Country bit seems to have disappeared as a profession, but the capacity within local authorities is woeful in terms of regional planning capacity, right the way through to the day-to-day detail.
Yeah, we've lost 30%, haven't we, over the last 2-3 years?
Anyway, yeah. I wanted to throw a rock in the pool and say, from a human rights perspective, I spent 20 years of my profession working in the central belt, in the non-sexy bits, with all the health problems and things. And my chief exec used to say that if you live in a disadvantaged area and you are unemployed and you are on a low income, national parks might as well be on Mars in terms of their accessibility. So there is something about the disconnect between people's daily needs for recreation and health, all the things that we've been talking about, and the whole concept of national parks as previously viewed, and I do think it's beholden on us as we go forward to think about accessibility. So I'm delighted to hear about how does this align with other agencies.
Transport Scotland.
Yes. So how can we make it possible that it doesn't cost 150 quid to get a family of 4 out of the East End of Glasgow on a train, on a bus to a place, and actually think about the consequences of, if these areas are so special, how can we make them accessible? So I would really support responses that say that this is a whole society issue that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nick, was that your hand?
Yeah, it's kind of allied to that, really. I just, it's again quite provocative, but I think I worry a little about the idea of a national park sucking the energy and the attention in terms of landscape, and we persist with a sort of dichotomous view of the landscape, that we have protected areas and we have everywhere else where everyone actually lives, and they travel to the national parks, and you know, the national parks sort of suck up the energy and the funding and everyone's attention. And I think I love the national parks, I'm sure we all do, but I think there is a question there that a wider view could generate more benefits, and that the national park in a way designates an area that's already inherently beautiful. Does it change an awful lot?
Does it need to have more overt justification in community benefit, socioeconomic stability, to justify their existence? Or
yeah, I think just looking at the fundamentals, is the national park concept came about during the war, in very different times, and has that time passed, and we now need to be thinking of a landscape in a more democratic way.
Yeah. The Borders National Park proposal is very much a community event, and that has very much gone on the community benefit side. That's its justification, that they can see massive wider rural as well as focused in settlements, benefits of having this recognition of this landscape being of that quality or that appropriate connection, because they see themselves as part of the Northumberland National Park, even though they're in Scotland.
That's interesting to hear,
Yeah.
because it's more of a ground up.
Yeah, definitely.
New to
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to check there's nobody online who wants to make a comment or put their hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, can I just, it sort of comes up what Sue was saying there about where national parks are, and it's quite interesting to see what the recent looking at in 2013 was. Again, they're all very rural areas. But when we talk about sort of special landscape areas, I just wonder whether there's been any thought gone into urban areas. And do you know,
well, there is a proposal for a Glasgow National Park.
It's one of the most deprived areas, Dunby Dykes, that sort of thing.
Yeah. There has been a proposal, literally, it's been in the press. So I don't know who's leading on it, but there is a proposal for Glasgow to have a national park, to be a whole national, the whole Greater Glasgow area to be a national park.
National Park, City, National Park.
Yeah. So it emerged not long after the London, the National Park for London kind of emerged, which I was a little bit involved with because I was at John Muir Trust at the time. And initially it kind of sounds really quite bonkers, but when you kind of get underneath it, what it was really trying to do was to get people to think differently about the green space actually that they were surrounded by, and to give it value. So it wasn't about trying to turn it into something different. Actually, it was kind of making more of what they've got, and it would then also kind of underpin, I think, progressive decision making about green spaces to drive up standards, etc. So I think it was almost a response to Nick's point, in that, you know, value from the environment isn't something that only happens to rich people over there. Actually, the real need is kind of here. And I think it was quite a provocative thing to do, but it's actually gained a lot of traction in London.
And it's still so in Glasgow as well. The
Yeah.
still there.
Because what do you mean by national? In a national what? You know, in a city environment, conservation environment, what is nationally perceived as
Well, you
part
could
of
say,
that
for
term is a
example-
very different list of components.
But, sorry, Holiday Park, for example, is a national icon. It's in every single Scottish piece of literature.
Yeah.
But I just wonder about, when we talk about national parks, is it just because it's in a city, so therefore it's only city inhabitants that use it, so therefore we should consider it as a national park? It's an interesting definition. It comes back to what the concept of a national park is and what is there. So I think we need to sort of think a lot more about that.
I think it leads also on, sorry Sarah, just also a little bit, is actually looking also at other landscaping related designations which are part of, you know, a list of a population of designation, recognition, specialness in landscape settings, whether it's a national park or whether it's a national scenic areas or regional park. They're really, you know, needing attention. And national scenic areas still only protected by a circular. Regional parks are really falling off the map, literally. And there's a lot of other things behind the national park topic.
Okay, I can come to you in a second, Sarah.
Sorry.
Beryl, would you like to read out your question? If you unmute yourself. I'm desperate to see if the technology will.
She's still muted.
Oh, right. I'm unmuted. Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a lot of focus on national parks and availability and accessibility. But I think the idea is that we should have, what we need to look at is proximity of people to a range of different areas for recreation and enjoyment of nature. So somebody might be in the central belt, couldn't afford to get up to the national parks, but there might be near them some sort of local park, a national nature, you know, some other sort of designation. And, you know, talking about, you know, national parks, are they just for the wealthy? Well, no, they're not. Let's face it, national parks are working landscapes. There are deprived areas in national parks. I was in Aviemore for about 5 days last week, and I saw poor people, you know, so they're not really exclusive just for the rich. And I think national parks are where we can try to help and support things that are important, we think, and hopefully other people do too, are important for the nation. Because national parks can be exemplars. Someone has already mentioned soil and conserving soil microflora and microfauna. National parks are in a unique position in that they can try to achieve nature conservation and good land management. You even have cultural issues that they can address. They can provide good recreation, all sorts of things which are desirable in the environment can be delivered via the national parks. And that can be used as exemplars for elsewhere. Of course, that needs partnerships with local people, landowners, and so on. And whatever, you know, there are pros and cons about national parks, but they have, along with a suite of national scenic areas, areas of natural beauty, nature, NNRs, and all the rest of it, they have an important role. And I think, I don't think, you know, I'm concerned, as Rachel is, with the timescale of delivering a new national park or even a couple of national parks. I think that we should just go with the legislation we have, but implement it and use it better, and support the legislation we have with more ministerial direction, policy statements, and so on. I don't think we've got time to change the Act, and I don't think it needs changing that much. Personally, I think it's good to go. It just needs perhaps a bit of tweaking in how it's interpreted.
Okay, thank you very much, Beryl.
Sorry,
thanks for that. Yeah, no, that's okay. We haven't got time to respond. I just want to pick up a couple more comments online, if that's okay. And then we're probably going to have to close this bit of the session off. So, Elsa, are you able to read out your comment?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, you just need to speak up a bit, but yeah.
Ah, okay. No, I just wanted to mention, it wasn't really so much a question, it was just a comment. It was just that about the Scottish Geology Trust. I just think they would be a really important organisation to include in this conversation, particularly because they're aiming to look at the sort of the way geological heritage connects with sustainability into the future. And I think really, somebody mentioned it in one of the earlier talks, how geology really underpins many of the things we're talking about here. People's love of the landscape, access to the landscape, and also that includes urban geology, I think, not just scenic beauty, you know, it's also the sort of the grittier stuff too. So I just wanted to mention them as people to speak to and to bring into the conversation.
Thanks, Elsa. And maybe that's another plea for Holyrood Park as a
we do have a
national
geopark for the northwest already, don't we? It seems to be very successful, particularly for education and access.
We've only got time for one more comment, and maybe Angus Miller, if you're there. Another one, maybe speaking up for geology, I don't know.
Yeah, yes, hi, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry not to be there, but it's been a really interesting discussion here. My point was just kind of thinking about all these great areas that would be, could be national parks, and actually, is it because we make it too complicated and too expensive? Actually, you know, we should have 10 national parks. Slightly inappropriate comment from Twitter yesterday that the Scottish Government should just allow areas to self-identify as national parks, but you know, it's almost like, you know, we need more. I think the model that we're trying to fit into, for me, doesn't really work. But no, okay. Maybe it's just it needs much more money spent on it, of course. But then, you know, there's no money. So. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm sure Pete is listening to this with maybe no surprises around these kind of range of comments, but yeah, you've got a lot to deal with. Okay.
One quick question that Pete might know the answer to. Do we know what the annual budget is for the two national parks?
Roughly, it's about 15 million between the two of them.
Yeah. So it's peanuts.
15 for two.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the other thing, is that people assume there's a lot of money, and there isn't. It's a tiny amount of money relative to laying a mile of road somewhere or something like that. So.
Well, again, when I went to this meeting about the possibility of getting all the community benefits from the wind farms and the land mills together in one fund, it was several £million. That was just for one form of development.
Okay, all right.
Interesting.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Thanks everybody for contributions. Okay, so we're now slightly behind time, that's my fault, but we're going to just move into the last component of our half-day conference. So Pete Rawcliffe from Nature Scott has very, very kindly agreed to come along and talk to us to stimulate some discussion about Scotland's Landscape Charter. Now, some of you will have been involved in developing this, or maybe aware of its publication back in 2010. And in some senses, we haven't really moved on, because, you know, this Landscape Charter, I think, came about because there was a kind of understanding and a need for a commitment to landscape, to bring the community together and to find some kind of mechanism to kind of bring value and attention to it. And to some extent, that was more or less the conversation that we had with the current minister earlier on in the year about trying to make a renewed commitment to landscape. And most, I think, of what we've been discussing today, I think, has been kind of throwing up the challenges of how you do that in public policy terms, given the breadth of interest, impact and opportunity that landscapes in Scotland have. So we deliberately wanted to open up a discussion about whether we think that the concept or the idea of a landscape charter should be rebooted or not. Pete.
Thanks, Stuart. Good to be with you today, and really good not to be talking about national parks as well. And as Stuart says, we're going to talk about the Landscape Charter. A trip down memory lane for some, but I guess the reason for putting it on the agenda is to think about the future. And just listening into the last hour's discussion, we obviously live in a really incredibly challenging world. Lots of challenges, environment, social and economic, and a lack of capacity amongst the public sector and probably the private sector as well around it, and certainly in our communities. So all those things are really difficult, but actually it's a really exciting time because of some of that, because there is change in the air, and you've talked about some of that as well today. I think I've never known officials and ministers be at a stage where they recognise that doing the same old thing will get the same old results, and that's no longer good enough. So there's a lot of change in the air, and some of the stuff, the rights-based stuff, is really interesting, totally new. It doesn't feature in the Charter at all. You wouldn't expect it to. The Charter was produced in 2010 and reflects some of that, certainly the language. I'm a bit worried now that the first slide I've got here is the old PowerPoint that I probably sent by mistake because our file system. So we're interested to see what slides come forward in the next few minutes. For those who haven't seen the Charter before, it was simply a call to action aimed at 4 stakeholder groups, sort of listed here: communities of what we now call place of interest, individuals and NGOs, landowners and managers, which is D in that slide, local authorities and public sector and Scottish Government. So, and it basically asked a few simple things of each of those groups, and the idea was that people read the Charter, sign up to it, and do some of that stuff. So pretty simple. Based on the ELC, which is really interesting in terms of what we've been talking about, rights-based approaches and bottom-up approaches, but trying to make it as simple a language as possible. And again, we can probably say it didn't quite manage that. It was designed by a group of people, so it probably isn't as clear as it could be today. And it also took an inclusive approach in line with the ELC. So a range of interests that we need to recognise and shape and manage in terms of the landscape. And it was about landscape change. Despite perhaps what the SNP thought about it, it wasn't saying we're going to preserve every aspect. Actually, we were saying landscape is relevant everywhere. The cover choice was deliberate, and it was actually saying landscape needs to be managed because it is changing whatever we're trying to do to stop it. The Charter was also a product of this report, and if you haven't seen this report, dig it out. It's still worth a read, still really relevant, and actually, I guess the SLA recommendations built on it last year. The Charter was sort of waylaid partly by a change of administration. We went from yellow to green and yellow and red to yellow and to yellow. Lib Dem Labour to SNP. So new ministers, new brooms wanted to do things differently. And Mike Russell, who actually was quite sympathetic to this agenda, focused the SLC particularly around the Charter, particularly around communities. And it didn't get the ministerial endorsement that it required. It got, I would have to say, the second best thing, which of course is the chair of Nature Scott, SNH as the time as a forward, and the chair of the Landscape Forum as well. But we didn't get ministerial endorsement, and it undoubtedly suffered as a result of that. Interestingly, other charters have emerged and have copied this. Multitask. So supported by a broad range of organisations. If you look at the Nature Scott website, there's about 30 organisations listed there who signed it. But it's fair to say the original momentum behind it has been lost, and it was a long time ago. 2010, we all had more hair and more energy back in those days, possibly. There are some notable omissions on the signature list. National parks don't feature. Some bodies which don't exist don't feature, such as the Land Commission. So the landscape has changed. And what we've never done as an organisation or collectively is actually done what I'd call a soft audit, a review in Sarah's terms about the impacts of those who have signed it. Did it change anything? Despite the sort of gloom in that prognosis, two most recent signatures came out of the blue in the last 24 months, called the Dale Glen Heritage, East Kilbride and District Historical Archive. So two organisations found it and wanted to be part of it. So there's some resonance there, particularly amongst the communities who it was primarily aimed at. And of course it's been copied too. Copied in Northern Ireland, nearly word for word. That has got a ministerial endorsement on it. And copied by the Geodiversity Charter, which came a few years later, which also has a ministerial endorsement on it as well. So imitation is the best form of whatever the analogy is. So there's probably something in here as a mechanism. So the big question for today is it time for a refresh? What next? Looking back, the launch of this thing probably was a high point in political and policy interest in landscape. I think it's fair to say we live in very different times when the visibility of landscape and its political relevance seems to be at a low ebb. I'm a half pint full sort of person, so as I said, the challenges that we face means that landscape is going to come back to the fore, and actually a landscape approach permeates virtually everything we're doing in Scotland at the moment, because it requires looking at multiple interests, multiple benefits, getting the governance and engagement right, and that's a landscape scale approach in effect. So let's be positive. But can a charter or something like it raise the profile and resourcing of good landscape practice? If so, is the approach to landscape set out in the charter still relevant? And if it is still relevant, is it a useful tool? Or have we had the day of charters? Do we need to invent something else now? And is it sufficient in itself? So we could put a lot of energy into the charter, missing some of the other important things that are coming on. And the final key question is, if we did collectively want to do something, how would we prepare a new one? The forum, which sort of begat this, had been meeting for about 2-3 years, so there was actually pretty good discussion which led to the charter. So it's not an insignificant challenge. If you want to do it properly and involve quite a few stakeholders. Hoping this last slide will be here. One of the things I do for Nature Scot is I chair the ELC coordination group of public bodies and Scottish Government departments. It meets probably twice a year. Main role is in terms of thinking about reporting to Council of Europe via DEFRA on implementation of ELC. But one of the things we have looked at is whether we should review the charter. So here's some quotes, which will remain anonymous. I hopefully I've made them as anonymous as I can. So in terms of relevance of the landscape approach in the charter, we think it's a definite yes. But it needs updated to better reflect the current language and priorities we have on climate change and biodiversity and rights. And of course, the cultural landscape interest has changed remarkably in this time as well, with, I guess, the cultural heritage rediscovering landscape, can I be provocative, in Our Place in Time, and the joint work with HES and Nature Scot have done on landscape. What the ELC group concluded was the second two questions were much less clear. So really interested in views on those today. So is it the best tool, and how do we produce it? What role can SLA play here? Is it a stick that you want to pick up and run with? Do we need ministerial endorsement for it to make it have an impact? And if so, how are we going to go on about getting that at present? And I guess ultimately where you can be critical of Nature Scot, and I guess some of the other organisations around this, we didn't really promote the charter to communities. So actually, how do we actually, when we do a charter, make it real and relevant to communities? And I'll stop there. Just looking at the clock.
Thanks, Pete. No, I've just seen how badly I've managed to chair the timing of this. But that's okay. I think we can eat into lunchtime by 5 to 10 minutes, if that's all right with everybody. Okay, so thank you, Pete, for that. So there's a direction of travel that is emerging from one round of conversations that you've had. I don't know, is anybody thinking that this is a bad idea or a waste of time? Does anybody want to kind of have a counter view?
I was just going to say, even though it didn't have ministerial sign-off, it still performed a role. So that shouldn't really uphold the idea of updating. The terminology is looking dated. There's no reason why I shouldn't put it out again, because I seem to remember in the darkness of time that the reason we went for ministerial sign-off is because the Landscape Forum, which existed before it, had been disallowed to exist. And we weren't allowed to have a Landscape Forum anymore. So this idea sort of developed over time. We thought we needed a ministerial, but I don't know if we do, actually. With the membership of the group as it stands, they're not all publicly funded bodies in it, so why?
Well, I guess.
I mean, if we can get it, yes, but if it's going to be a problem and they've got too much else to do and it'll take too long, to do it anyway.
I guess the point comes around effectiveness, because if it's just words on a bit of paper, you know, it's even one step below words on a bit of paper that designate an area or the sea. So, I mean, you know, you can argue, well, it's not going to do any harm, but how much good could it do, I suppose, if it had something which underpinned it and had a bit more kind of teeth?
We've got 60 plus members of it. Anyway, is that correct? Over 60 organisations?
So 60. What, 60 people in the SLA or 60 people signed up to the charter?
I don't know. Yes, SLA's got 60 organisations. It would be a product of, would it be your product, Nature Scot's product, or would it be SLA's product, or would it be a joint product?
Well, that's all up for grabs. That's an interesting point though. There's only 30 signatures on our website, so where are the other 30 SLA members, please?
Yeah, do it first.
I mean, to me, it's certainly got life in it, and it's worth trying to reboot. I mean, I think the word charter is quite interesting. It seems quite dated. I like it. It's been like a pirate or Magna Carta. But if you were to call it Scottish Landscape Convention, and it's the kind of son or daughter of the European Landscape Convention, I think you might get more government buy-in. And you think with 30 by 30, you think we protected areas. Essentially, government's committed to something at a national level because it's international reputations at stake, which then cascades down in the real world effect on us. And I think if we could link our Scottish equivalent to the European equivalent, I think given the current political climate, that would go down quite well. And then the government would have to live with the consequences of that decision. But linking it as much as possible to the European dimension, I think would be good.
I was just going to say exactly the same sort of thing as you said about the European Landscape Convention, about Brexit. The political landscape has changed quite considerably, and you might find it might get quite a lot of ministerial support now, especially for aligning with the European Landscape Convention.
Stuart, there's a comment from Angus Miller who needs to go at once, so you might have just 2 seconds to tell us it.
Okay, Angus, you there? Just want to read it out.
Oh no, yeah. I think he's just had to dash. So he was saying that the Geodiversity Charter was very much inspired by the Landscape Charter. What they managed to do differently was to maintain the momentum after the launch. And then he also had another comment saying that he's not convinced that the ministerial foreword to the Geodiversity Charter really added any value. It didn't mean that there was any greater ministerial or government involvement after the publication.
That was Rosanna Cunning, wasn't it?
No.
For the Geodiversity Charter.
Yeah. Because there was something else we're trying to get through.
I thought it was it. Yeah.
I think just an observation that we're in this parliamentary session between now and 2026 is incredibly busy in terms of legislature. We've not known a time as busy as this. We've got the agricultural bill, we've got the land reform bill, we've got the natural environment bill, we've got the human rights bill, we've got biodiversity strategy review. So if there's going to be a revamp of the landscape convention, then it does need to have some sort of map showing how it interconnects as interdependent with the other key reforms that are happening in our land, and I think particularly also how it connects with the land rights and responsibility statements as well. So just having a little bit of that mapping so it makes sense to people. It's not another thing, it's an overarching concept. I think would be really helpful.
Yeah.
I think that mapping idea is really interesting one. And it's diverted me. Oh yeah, that was trying to remember what I was going to say. So perhaps there's an interesting parallel there when there is such a political driver, but political with a small and a capital P, on the 30 by 30, that by saying that the Charter representing it as Scotland's sort of contribution to that ELC is about saying we've got 30 by 30 on the one hand, but we're not ignoring the rest of the 70. The ELC and the Charter is about the whole thing, and the two can complement one another. So rather than trying to conflict, and the idea of you know, we've spoken a lot today about how we bring different interests together on what is effectively one chunk of land, and I like that idea of mapping both interests but also the tools and how you connect to them, and because that can help you direct or focus attention in timely sort of areas.
Okay.
I was involved with the Landscape Charter once upon a time, and I always thought that it suffered hugely from not having ministerial support. But it wasn't, in a sense, it's not because it didn't have it, it's because it was designed to get it. And when it didn't, it kind of had its teeth pulled in a sense. So I think it's really interesting to see that there's still people out there, bodies out there that are making use of it now, both to copy and to add to. So clearly there's life in it and room for a revamp of it. I like the idea of what's been said about aligning it more explicitly to the European Landscape Convention. Maybe we'll leave aside the Brexit issue of what is the UK government going to do in aligning itself with EU issues. That's another matter, I suppose. But in terms of the things I've heard this morning, I think somehow you need to find something which can do many things, and the mapping is probably the way forward here. So you need something that provides the high level support, or the link into the high level structure. But you also need something that in a way provides a template for how you manage landscape at a very local level, or really at any level, which integrates the different issues that we've been hearing about. So the different aspects of landscape, the issues of sustainability that we've heard about in various forms over the course of the day. And so in that sense acts as almost as a good guide, something to aspire to that can be then used in different contexts in response to what's going on and by communities of interest that want to take it forward.
Okay,
Not
nice summing up. Sorry, you didn't introduce yourself at the...
Sorry, my name's Leslie Guinness. I used to work for what's now Historic Parliament Scotland, and I used to be involved in landscape things from that perspective.
Brilliant.
Definitely a Historic Parliament person.
Yeah, okay, fabulous. Okay, look, we obviously got some ideas, some thoughts, and certainly from a SLA perspective, I think we need to kind of take those away and probably represent them back to you in some kind of official capacity, actually, because I think that probably helps to move the thing forward, because it will be something that we'd then ask you to respond to, I suppose. But anyway, I hope that's some useful discussion and thoughts.
Yeah,
that we can throw in.
Definitely. It depends particularly if we get a letter from you.
Yes, exactly. I knew you wanted a letter, so that was all. Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much. Well, I'm just going to hand over to Gavin McGregor. So Gavin's the Director of Archaeology Scotland and has very recently joined the Executive Committee of the SLA. And Gavin's got the lovely job of winding us up or closing us down.
Thank you. Yes, my goodness, what a lot of thoughts and what a lot of wonderfully provocative presentations. I'm going to try and sort of cut across a few of them, and we started with the kind of questions that gauging if there is still support for the ELC and whether there was interest in a kind of refreshed Scotland landscape charter. It's clear we keep coming back to ELC. It's been deeply influential and deeply foundational in terms of a lot of our practices, professionally, in terms of policy, and in terms of how things are articulated to and with communities through a range of things like financial instruments, such as the landscape partnership schemes which I've mentioned a few times. And I think Sarah's review of where we got to is very important, because it actually charted potentially a journey that the implementation of the Landscape Convention was going on internationally across Europe in the sort of the first part of the noughties. And we got through the phases of kind of baseline and landscape characterisation and thinking about all the kind of nuts and bolts that we do really well through designation and through measuring and through generating data. And that's great, we need to continue to do that in certain ways. But then there came a point, and I should explain. Sorry, my little white book. This takes me back to the last time I really deeply thought about these issues, when I was lucky enough to attend one of the Landscape Convention meetings in Thessaloniki. And not only is it the convention, but it was the supporting narratives from 2008 that have a series of other analyses about how implementation articulates in kind of more practical nuts and bolts terms. And I think that's where we got to on this journey. And I think when you left us, Sarah, was in the way we've heard, the world got complicated and the agendas changed. And landscape struggled as a field to keep up and show its relevance in various ways. Now, as Peter said, it is fundamentally relevant and fundamentally important because, as we all know, it is the unifying key. It's the space that brings us all together. It's the place that we do, from those baseline processes and from that evidence, try and make informed or help inform decision making in evidence-based ways. And a few other things came out in terms of those discussions that we've heard and those points that were raised about what we value and how we adapt to change. It struck me in a couple of points were made. What value we get from land, What's the land for and who's it for? Those are the sort of fundamental questions we've heard and resonating through things. It struck me in terms of maybe the land effort that Ada Leopold would have talked about many, many years ago. There's always been something fundamental in the bones of landscape practice about the interrelationship between people and those other dimensions, the ecological, the geological, that we've heard talked about. So one of the other aspects that struck me listening to the various presentations was about the issues of the Charter. And I think it was raised that it was founded on a series of principles. I think those principles are perhaps something that we have revisited, because principles are those series of kind of ethical values that should inform how we all behave and how we navigate our practices and our influence in the spheres that we do occupy through a series of kind of value-based behaviours. And I think in terms of the issues we were hearing about kind of justice, where we prioritise and how we make decisions in terms of some of these big opportunities in terms of national parks, then holding on to those principles as we go forward will be very, very important, and revisiting and refreshing them. And there was a couple of things that struck me in reflection as well, that we didn't talk about some of the things that were mentioned in the Landscape Convention, such as landscape observatories. There wasn't really much discussion amongst us all about landscape quality objectives. I know there's work being done around about that, but that idea about who defines the quality objectives and how we work together to either special qualities, or do we actually mean those qualities are other things, other negotiated values that we look to our future vision. So the other dimensions that come across as well is this tension between working within the frameworks of 30 by 30 and the opportunity we've got with landscape as a unifying field of being 100 by 100. Landscapes are for all. The future of landscapes with these big issues and challenges we face have major consequences in different ways in terms of biodiversity, health and well-being, opportunities for communities, people and place in a variety of ways. So landscape is, in a sense, that complex system that we all understand is just too big and too overwhelming at times. So we go back to our silos, where it encounters those wicked problems. So not only is there a remarkable field for action and for reflection and for support, there's also a remarkable opportunity to mobilise in various ways. And I think this came across, again, the Charter in a sort of final little point, that the value of the Charter potentially is the process of bringing those communities of interest at that time around about a statement of value and around about a statement of importance of landscape. And maybe from what I've heard with the response and discussion around about the Landscape Charter or Scottish Landscape Convention, then there is undoubtedly a value to it, but how that is taken forward is going to require some further reflection and thinking, not least because of issues of capacity, not least of issues of care, not least because actually, maybe at this time, with community empowerment, with justice-based issues, maybe it's a conversation about the nature of this document and the technical process, that we need to bring other people on board with that conversation and with that decision-making process about whether a charter or whether a convention, why is it relevant to people's day-to-day lives. But there were some really interesting points there. I think mapping that system that we occupy, that we inhabit. You can't beat a good old infographic at times to just show how landscape is, you know, the unifying field and how things articulate through various processes of power, through various processes of forces or pressures for change. And actually, we've heard a lot about adverse impacts, but what about those beneficial impacts or those opportunities that are there through a landscape lens. And then, a final bit from experience of practitioner. One of those things that we found very useful on the ground was things like landscape conservation action plans. They actually took all the technical information, took some short-term objectives and outcomes, and tried through partnership to deliver in a variety of ways. And I think what came across again from Sarah's presentation is that we have got a toolkit. We do have financial instruments, and we do have a vision that is about ethical, justice-based issues that takes a more than human perspective, but looks at all landscapes. So going back to that fundamental point that was in the ELC, it was about all landscapes, degraded, everyday, and those special places that we value so greatly. I don't think I've done any justice to summing up the breadth of the conversation today, but I think from what I've heard, both the ELC and the Landscape Charter, Scotland's Landscape Charter, potentially has huge relevance as we go forward. But how we work together and navigate to re-energise around about these pieces of work is perhaps the next conversation. I think that's all I'll try and say.
Thanks very much.